This will be our last class for the Joshua and Judges class. I will reserve a couple of statements till the end of the second hour. But one thing that I would like each of you to do is to, for me or let me know, is about doing the one-page papers instead of doing the having test. Is that profitable for you, or is it easier to do the test? How did that work out? My own feeling was that it worked out well, but you all might have different feelings on that, and so I would like to at least know your feelings concerning doing it in that manner. I thought it would be a little bit better doing it that way instead of having the test, that it will help you to learn more and retain that knowledge a little bit longer. So let me know about it. My Bible program crashed, and so I'm hoping that it's kind of working in the background right now, trying to get things straightened out, so it might be a little bit different for me this morning as to covering the material, but hopefully that will be fixed before too long. But we were going to enter into the 11th chapter of Judges this morning. And in that 11th chapter, it deals with Jephthah and the Ammonites. And in those first 11 verses, Lance and Howard both said that you like it, so if they asked me to teach again, I might continue doing it that way. In chapter 11, verses 1 through 11, we have Jephthah rejected, but then he's called to be leader. In verse 1, Israel is under oppression now to Ammon, and while the Philistines are mentioned here also, it is mainly Ammon that we are going to deal with. Later with Samson, it might be that this is part of the same oppression, and that Ammon is mentioned here and dealt with in relationship to Jephthah. And then Samson is mentioned in connection with this same oppression, but dealing with, or Samson dealing with the Philistines instead. They are crying out to God for deliverance. Seems everyone likes it that way better, at least doing it the paper, and that it will be profitable to you. I hope so, and hope that you can keep those with you and maybe refer to them as a fast way to doing it, looking over the notes, and hopefully that was the intent, and that it would help you to retain the knowledge a little bit longer. Israel is crying out to God for deliverance here, and they are now looking for a person who will deliver them. We see here in 11 and verse 1. Gilead, that is mentioned here, is applied to an area on the east of Jordan, and that's one application of it. But here, of course, it is used as the name of Jephthah's father. His name was Gilead. Jephthah was a mighty man of valor. His name means that he has opened, or he has opened. And it might deal with he has opened the womb, is one way in which some have expressed it. He was the son of a harlot, which might give us an indication of the depths of immorality of the nation that we see at this time frame. We know Jephthah had already distinguished himself as a man of valor because they sought him out to lead them. It wasn't initially him coming to them, but they went to him, so because he is a mighty man of valor. In verse 2, Gilead's sons grew up and cast out Jephthah. He must have grown up in his father's house, even though he was the son of a harlot. But they apparently cast him out so that he would not inherit anything of Gilead's. Possibly Gilead was dead at this time, and so with his mother being a harlot, it was easy to cast him out, and thus he was an outcast. It mentions his mother was a strange woman. Strange, as used oftentimes in the Bible, has reference to someone who is unauthorized. In relationship to Israel, they were not to marry those who were Canaanites, and thus it might have reference here when it says that she was a strange woman, that she was a Canaanite. It could be simply from the standpoint, though, that she was a harlot, but I think the idea that she was a Canaanite is a very real possibility on that. In verse 3, Jephthah fled to Tob to escape his brothers. Tob was on the east side of the Sea of Galilee between Ammon and Syria. And the vain men of verse 3, that there were vain or gathered vain men to him, has reference to empty, idle, or worthless, ethically speaking. They were worthless ethically. They went out with him refers to going out to fight with him. His leadership of these vain men would have indicated his being a man of valor to others, and that's why we see them seeking him out there in verse 1. In verse 4, the Ammonites then decide to go to war against Israel. And in verse 5, the Ammonites make war against Israel, or when the Ammonites make war against Israel, they send for Jephthah now. And notice the people's change of attitude toward Jephthah. It's interesting, they don't seem to care that his brothers have cast him out, that he is thus an outcast from them, that his mother was a harlot, a strange woman. They now are needing help. And because they want help, they believe that Jephthah, verse 7, is the one who can help them in this battle against Ammon and lead them in battle against Ammon. They now, because of that need, they want him to fight for them, and they come to him asking him, will you help us? They had mistreated him previously. So verse 7, he's basically, you've got to make a good case for leadership, for me being your leader now. And also think of the humility that it would have taken on their part. They had mistreated him and expel. He says, did not ye hate me and expel me out of my father's house? So here's the way that they had mistreated him. And now then they're asking him, would you come and be our leader and fight for us? So there's a lot of humility after mistreating someone in that way to come back to that individual and ask them, please lead us and fight for us. Verse 8, they want Jephthah to go fight for them, but they also want him to be ruler at Gilead over them. Gilead here would include the 2.5 tribes on the east side of Jordan, the Transjordan area. In verse 9, Jephthah is giving God credit for defeating the Ammonites, and it's an interesting aspect of this that here's Jephthah, and he uses the name of Jehovah more frequently than any other person in Judges. Now, that's not to say that he was more faithful than anyone else or anything along that line, but at least he uses the Lord, or uses the name of Jehovah more frequently than any other person. But he does give Jehovah credit for defeating the Ammonites. In verse 10, these elders now make a public agreement with him that they will retain him as their leader after he defeats the Ammonites. He didn't want it just in a private setting. He wanted assurance of the truthfulness that, yes, after we defeat, and after God defeats the Ammonites with me as your leader, you're going to retain me as the leader. It's one thing a lot of times with individuals to do something in private, but once you get in public, there's a little bit of difference there. They won't do it publicly, and so he's afraid if this is done only in private that they might not follow through with that agreement that they've made with him after he defeats the Ammonites. And so they take an oath to God about this and also make it in a public agreement. Verse 11, and we might add to that, it really, as far as our word is concerned, it should not matter whether it's done in public or in private. We need to be always truthful, and when we state something, we should live up to that agreement that we've made. Now, there might be certainly some cases where we cannot live up to that agreement, but we should live up to the agreements that we make with individuals. And whether it's public, private, doesn't make any difference. As far as someone who is honest, that's the way they are going to deal with others. If our word is not our bond, then we don't have, we're not doing and we're not living right in that type of a situation. Well, verse 11 then, upon these assurances, Jephthah went out with them, and the people made him their leader. He again repeats the agreement to all of the people so that everyone would know about this agreement. A good point here is that God can use anyone. Job mentioned, sounds like Jephthah was dealing with a bunch of lawyers, and the way some lawyers, and I say some, use words, and they will use the trickery of words to get out of what they actually state, and so that very well may be true. I think an interesting point here, though, is that God can use anyone who will submit to him. Jephthah was born of harlot. He was forsaken by his family, cast out of his home, exiled from his people, yet God was going to use him in a great way. And in Hebrews 11th chapter, in that listing of men of faith, Jephthah's name is listed among those names. He was a great man of faith. yet look at his situation, we would say that's not the best of situations, to be his mother a harlot, and all of these other things, forsaken by his family, cast out, exiled from the people. Doesn't sound good for him. But the choices that he made in living his life set forth a type of lifestyle that made him a great man of faith. It's the choices that we make, not the circumstances that we are born into. And if we will make the right choices, and making the choices to live for God and do what God wants us to do, and always standing for the truth, then God can use us in a great way. Even though we might not have been born with as we put it, a silver spoon in our mouth, God can still use us in a great way if we will be obedient to Him. In now verses 12 through 28, we have Jephthah's negotiations with Ammon. Jephthah's negotiations with Ammon. In verse 12, Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonites and asked them, "Why are you fighting against us?" And so here, at least it appears as if Jephthah is seeking for a peaceful solution. He's not wanting to go to war. He's not a warmonger. He's looking for that peaceful solution. Verse 13, they responded to Jephthah that they were coming to make war with them because Israel took their land when they came out of Egypt, and now then we want that land back. The area that he was wanting back was between the rivers Arnon and Jabbok and Jordan. This determination, we want this land back, and we don't care what happens. It's going to leave Israel with a choice of either surrendering the land or fighting. And there is no other alternative. You either surrender the land or you fight. And so at this point in time, fighting is going to be the end result. But verse 14, Jephthah sends some messengers back to the king of Ammon. He's still trying for this peaceful solution, and he's going to, in this, basically state, you don't have a right to this land. And, of course, they're going to reject it, and there is going to be a war, but that he's still seeking for that peaceful solution. In verse 15, Jephthah denies taking any land from Moab or from Ammon. And while they are now dwelling in that land, they did not take it from them. Israel took it from the Amorites, not the Ammonites. And just make the distinction between Amorites and Ammonites. Israel did not take it from Ammon. They took it from the Amorites. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown state concerning this that Jephthah's reply was clear, decisive, and unanswerable. First, those lands were not in the possession of the Ammonites when his countrymen got them, that they had been acquired by right of conquest from the Amorites, Judges 11:21. Secondly, he says the Israelites had now, by a lapse of 300 years of undisputed possession, established a prescriptive right to the occupation, Judges 11:22 and 23. And thirdly, having received a grant of them from the Lord, his people were entitled to maintain their right on the same principle that guided the Ammonites in receiving from their god Chemosh, or Chemos, the territory they now occupy, Judges 11:24. This diplomatic statement, so admirable for the clearness and force of its arguments, concluded with a solemn appeal to God to maintain, by the issue of events, the cause of right and justice, Judges 11:27. And so they lay out in very brief form what we're going to see through these next few verses as to Jephthah's reply to the Ammonites. So now then, as we go through this, verse 16, Jephthah is reminding Ammonites of the history and what really happened. They might have used, or as we so often are starting to see in our society, a revisionist history about this. And so he's going to remind them, here's what really happened. When Israel came out of Egypt and passed through the Red Sea, they came to Kadesh. In verse 17, at Kadesh, they asked the king of Edom to allow them to pass through their land. The king of Edom refused the request. They also did the same thing, asked the king of Moab if they could pass through his land. Likewise, the king of Moab refused. Thus, Israel, he says, remained at Kadesh. Verse 18, they went through the wilderness and around Edom and Moab on the east side of Moab. They made camp on the other side of Arnon, making sure that they did not enter into Moab. Verse 19, Israel then sent to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, at Heshbon, asking him to allow them to pass through his land. And here in verse 19 we see the phrase, into my place. And you notice that into my place, that's going to be the land of Canaan that they're going to pass into. So let me pass through this land into my place, into the land of Canaan. But notice they call it my place, that this was a place that God was giving unto them. And thus it was theirs by right. Verse 20 then. He states that Sihon did not trust Israel, and so instead of allowing Israel to pass through his land to go to the land of Canaan, he instead came out and fought against them. Now remember, this is Sihon of the Amorites. The Ammonites are not being considered here. This is the Amorites. Verse 21, God delivered Sihon along with the Amorites, all of his people, into Israel's hand. And again, we see that Jephthah properly gives God the credit for the victory. He is continually recognizing God is the one who gives us these victories. But now then, continuing in verse 21, he basically says, this is how Israel came into the possession of the land of the Amorites. You're wanting what the Amorites and what we took from the Amorites. You don't have a right to it, is basically what he's telling them. This was the Amorites' land. It wasn't your land. Verse 22, the area which God gave them was from the wilderness on the east to the Jordan River, and between the rivers Arnon and Jabbok. Now that was the land that the Ammonites were wanting back and saying, we want this land and we're going to fight you for it. And verse 23 thus, he tells them, you have no claim to this land, because God gave it to Israel from the Amorites. You didn't possess it then, and God gave it to us from them. Verse 24. He then argues that they claim the right of possession to the land which their god, Chemosh, has given them. So he's saying in this, you believe your god, Chemosh, has given you the land that you're now living in. and thus you claim that land by right of your God giving it to you, according to your own claim. Well, God has given Israel this land. Therefore, we have the right to possess the land which Jehovah God has given unto us. He is making an argument against them that really they cannot answer, except we want the land and we're going to try and take the land even though it does not belong to us. Because he is proving this land does not belong to you. It was given to us by our God. You live in the land that you now live in, what you claim by right of what your God gave you. And if you have a claim to that land, then we have the right to claim this land as ours. Verse 25, he then appeals to look at Balak. When they had the problem with Balak, he didn't ask for his land back, and he did not try to go to war, Jephthah says, with us to try and get it back. Basically, Ammon's claim to the land is no better than Moab's. And since Moab did not try and get the land back, neither should the Ammonites. You just don't have any claim to it. Verse 26, it states that no one had asked for their land back for 300 years. Basically, we have possessed this land for 300 years and no one's asked for it back. Thus, you don't have a rightful claim to the land either, by reason of our possessing it for 300 years. The only reason, Jephthah states, the only reason you're now asking for it is because you believe you're powerful enough to take it by force now. Constable writes that Jephthah's reference to 300 years, verse 26, is an important benchmark in biblical chronology. It has been approximately 300 years since the Israelites had defeated Sihon and captured Heshbon, and he puts in 1406 BC. Shortly after Jephthah spoke these words, he defeated the Ammonites, verse 33, about 1106 BC, and ended the 18-year Ammonite oppression, 10 and verse 8. The Philistine oppression of Israel began at the same time as the Ammonite oppression, 10:7, in 1124 BC. The Philistines harassed Israel for 40 years, according to 13:1, which would be around 1124 to 1084 BC. The dates of the Philistine oppression are important because they provide a framework for the ministries of Eli and Samuel as well as Samson. This time reference, along with the one in 1 Kings 6:1, indicates that the Exodus took place about 1446 BC rather than about 1280 BC. There are some who want to revise the Exodus to this 1280 BC, a later date than really what it should be. Those would be more the liberal scholars, supposedly, of our day. This thus becomes important in a study of that biblical chronology. Verse 27, basically Jephthah says there's going to be a rendering of judgment, and the Lord will render that judgment. This is in relation to both the land that God is, in relationship to both, to the land that God is the one who will judge, who has the right to it, and the other aspect, that Ammon had wronged Israel in going to war with them. So God's going to render judgment upon this matter. He's going to render judgment in relationship to who has the right to the land. He's going to render judgment in relationship to the fact that Ammon has wronged us in going to war against us. Verse 28, king of Ammon rejected what Jephthah says. He just rejects it out of hand. He can't really argue with it because everything that Jephthah had stated was true. No argument, just we're not going to accept it. We're going to go to war against you, and we're going to try and take our land back. Shows that some people you just very simply cannot reason with. And every once in a while you will run across those type of individuals. You just cannot reason with some individuals. It doesn't matter how good your reasoning is, how right it is, they're not going to accept it. Now then, in verses 11 through verse 29 through 40, we have Jephthah's vow and the fulfillment of that vow. And we do want to spend a little bit of time in relationship to this vow. It is something that is important. But verse 29, God's Spirit came upon Jephthah. Now, we see the Spirit of God coming upon individuals throughout the book of Judges. And in relationship to that, that's probably having reference to the idea that that God is giving him direction as to what he should do, and also giving him power in overcoming the enemy. Joe mentioned about that they are implacable, and that's true. There's no way to placate them. They are not going to listen to reason. God's Spirit comes upon Jephthah thus to give him direction, to give him power in overcoming the Ammonites. He travels through Gilead, which Gilead would consist of Gad and Manasseh, at least that half tribe of Manasseh. And while we're not told why, it was possibly to recruit soldiers, since it was after this that he went to battle against Ammon. So it's very possible he's going through the land recruiting soldiers. And then once he recruits the soldiers, he goes to battle against the Ammonites. In verse 30, Jephthah now makes a vow to God prior to going into battle. The condition that he places is that of God delivering Ammon into his hands. If you will deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then verse 31 we'll see here's what I will do. Constable mentions one aspect, that Israel had done the same thing Jephthah did. The tendency to negotiate with God marked and marred her relationship with Yahweh during this period of her history. I would say it marks and mars a lot of individuals' relationship with God even today, that we will negotiate with God. God, if you will do this for me, then I'll do this. I'll be obedient to your will. I'll, as they might put it, I'll get into church and I'll start going to church all the time if you will just do this for me. For example, if you will just simply allow me to get out of this problem that I'm now in. And there's a lot of times we negotiate with God. God, just hear my prayer now and I'll do this. Well, that's not a good way to deal with God, because so many times what happens after we get out of that problem or whatever it is that we're negotiating with God with, we then turn away from our agreement in that regard and we just ignore it. I'll get into church if you'll do this for me, and God does it. Well, God, I didn't really mean it. I think I did all right by myself, so we don't really need your help anymore. And uh, or they might start going a few weeks, and then before long they drop out again. There's no real dedication and consecration, sadly, on their part. You know, that's what you see with Israel a great deal during this time. Through all of this cycle that we've seen, what is it? They go into oppression. God, deliver us from the oppressor, and we'll be faithful to you. But did they? No. They went right back into the apostasy. So that is that tendency to negotiate with God. To a great extent, that's what Jephthah is doing here. God, deliver the Ammonites in my hand, and here's what I'll do. Verse 31, he now sets forth what he will do. Whatever first comes out the door of the house, I'll offer it to God. One thing that we should notice in this is the fact that whatever we vow, especially to God, we should fulfill that vow. In Psalms 50 and verse 14, we see offer unto God thanksgiving, and pay thy vows unto the Most High. Ed mentions that we saw a lot of the same thing around 9/11 with people bargaining with God, and that's very true. We did. And yet if you look at the effects of that supposed spirituality of all of these individuals that suddenly got spiritual around 9/11 or just after 9/11, the majority of it is gone nowadays. Very short-lived. But we should do whatever we vow, especially if we vow unto God. We won't take the time and deal with that, but just think of all of the applications that we make and we could make to that. We can make it in relationship to our marriage vow. We vow before God that we will be faithful to our spouse. Are we? Whether sickness or health, rich, poor. And yet so many people that vow means nothing to them. When we're baptized in water for the forgiveness of our sins, we are in a sense making a vow to God that I'm going to be raised up out of that watery grave of baptism to walk in this newness of life and obedience to God and being the servant of God, Romans 6 chapter. And yet so many and yes, sadly, sometimes they never darken the doors of a church building. They want to get saved, but they don't want to live in the way in which God wants them to live. We need to do whatever we vow, and especially if that vow is in relationship to God. Now then, about this vow, and we'll discuss it more as we go on and as get to the end of the chapter. Some believe that the vow he made demanded a physical sacrifice, while others believe it was a spiritual sacrifice. And when I say physical and spiritual, I'm saying physical from the standpoint he actually physically offered his daughter, as we're going to see, as a burnt offering to God, as opposed to a spiritual sacrifice that he offered her from the sense that he stated that she would be dedicated to God as a virgin throughout her life. I'm going to state at the very beginning of this that I believe it is that spiritual sacrifice and not a physical sacrifice. Although I will mention that there are some very respected individuals in the religious world who believe it was an actual physical sacrifice. In fact, I was surprised at some of the individuals who hold that. But also in this verse 31, we see that there is a conviction which Jephthah possessed that God would deliver the Ammonites to him. That's seen in this making this vow. That, yes, I know God's going to deliver them into my hand, and thus, whenever I get home, that first thing that comes out of the house would be offered up to God. Verse 32, we see that the Lord did fulfill that. Jephthah goes to the Ammonites and defeats them, and the Ammonites are delivered into his hand. Again, that's in keeping with Jephthah's vow that he has made. And in this we again see and would point out the fact that God loves his children. He protects them. He cares for them. And that's why he delivered them. And we need to always remember within our life that God loves us and he cares for us. He's going to protect us as well when we're faithful to him. We have that assurance. Verse 33, Israel was given a great victory by God, and Jephthah destroyed 20 cities of Ammon, and thus subdues the Ammonites. Verse 34, when he returns home, his daughter comes out of the house to meet him. And she comes out with timbrels and dances, and this simply shows that she is greeting him with great joy. We see this same thing in Exodus, the 15th chapter, in verse 20, in relationship to their deliverance from Egypt, and that would be the song of Moses. And we see in verse 20 how that Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. Now then, we might ask the question, and does this authorize or give us an allowance for dancing today? Well, the answer is no. I don't know how I can make it much plainer than that. The modern day dance is sinful. It is wrong, and no one should be engaged in it. This dancing that's mentioned here is nothing like the modern day dance. I mean, there is just simply no comparison between the two. It would be like apples and oranges. It's not the same. This very simply, when it says that she comes out with timbrels and dances, is simply a jumping and a leaping for joy. That's the type of dancing that this is. And I kind of hesitate to call it dancing, even though the Bible does, and so I use that term, because the idea of dance within our minds is something else. It is, they're not even kin. This is just leaping and jumping up and down for joy. There's a joy that's being expressed, and that joy is seen in their excitement of it. And the dance, as far as what we see, was not a boy and a girl dancing together. That produces lust within an individual. And that's the reason for the modern day dance, because of the lust that it does produce. If young people want to challenge that, See if they'll get and start dancing one with another of the same sex. Ask at the prom if they're going to dance at the prom, then let's have one room for the boys and another room for the girls, and let's separate them, and let's see if they are willing to do that. They're not, because the modern day dance is generated toward causing lust within the boys and girls. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. He says maybe when a football player makes a touchdown, that would be the type of thing that you would be seeing here. And maybe the football players nowadays and some of the choreographed moves, that's a different subject, but it would be just someone, and maybe you see at the end of the game and they make a winning touchdown and you see people on the sidelines jumping up and down for joy. That's the idea that's being expressed here. She comes out with timbrels and she's jumping up and down for joy because God has delivered the Ammonites into their hands. Jephthah had only one child. It is this daughter. This emphasizes the severity of this vow because of the vow that he makes. Verse 35, when he sees her, it brings him great sorrow because he had made a vow and he cannot now go back on his promise. He plans on keeping it. And that's something that we all need to recognize and live up to. When we make the vow, we live up to the vow. Constable writes that Jephthah's name means he opens, and given my word is literally opened my mouth. Jephthah evidently believed that to go back on his vow to God would involve a denial of his integrity, his very name. He felt he would be denying everything he believed in and stood for. And that's right, he would have been. Just as we do when we give our word, when we open our mouth and give our word, then it is a denial of our integrity to go back against that word and not fulfill it. Our word is something that is and should be very important to us. Well, it's time for our break, and so we'll start here at this point after our break.